My name is Emma, and I am 28 years old. I never thought I would be the kind of woman to sit down and tell her life story to strangers, but maybe that's the only way to keep from drowning in the silence I've been forced to carry. People look at me now and see a polished woman in tailored suits, the title of CEO attached to my name like a shield. But before all of that, I was a daughter-in-law who was constantly told I didn't belong. I was the poor girl in a family that measured worth by wealth connections and appearances. I wasn't born into luxury. My parents were hardworking, honest people who did the best they could with what little they had. My father fixed cars in a neighborhood garage. My mother worked part-time at a bakery. We never had much, but we had love, and that mattered more to me than any brand name or car model. I studied hard-earned scholarships and built myself brick by brick. But none of that mattered to my husband's family, the Blackwoods. To them, bloodline and status were everything. When I married my husband, I thought love would be enough. He was charming, gentle, and he promised me we'd build a life separate from his family's shadow. I wanted so badly to believe him. But the moment I stepped into their world, I realized I was walking into a battlefield I hadn't prepared for. His mother eyed my thrift store dress at our engagement dinner and smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. His father shook my hand like he was evaluating a job applicant not welcoming a daughter. And his sister Victoria, well, she didn't even bother hiding her disdain. Victoria was everything. I was not glamorous, confident, born with silver spoons engraved with her initials. She had grown up in privilege, and she wore it like armor. To her, I was an interloper, a stain on their pristine family name. From the very beginning, she made sure I knew my place beneath her heels. It started small, subtle jabs at family dinners. "That's an interesting dress, Emma. Where did you find it?" "A clearance rack." Little reminders slipped into conversation about how much the Blackwoods had invested in my husband's education and how grateful I should be to marry into a family that could provide. She smiled as she said it, as though she were offering advice, but her eyes glittered with cruelty. "My husband always told me to ignore her. That's just how she is," he'd whisper. "Don't let her get under your skin." But words like that don't just slide off. They sink deep, especially when you hear them again and again. The worst part wasn't even her insults. It was how easily my husband's parents let them pass. They never defended me. They never told her to stop. If anything, they laughed along like her cruelty was entertainment at my expense. Slowly, I stopped expecting protection. Slowly, I learned to smile politely while swallowing the sting. But inside, I was keeping count. I kept count the night she accidentally spilled red wine on the only designer dress I had saved up for months to buy, smirking as she dabbed at the fabric with a napkin. I kept count the time she introduced me to her friends as my brother's charity case. I kept count every time she rolled her eyes when I spoke, every time she reminded me of where I came from. And through it all, I buried myself in work. I had climbed from scholarships to internships, from internships to management positions. By the time I was 27, I had quietly built a career most people twice my age would envy. But the Blackwoods didn't know. They never asked. They never cared. To them, I was a shadow at the edge of their glamorous lives. When Victoria invited me to her company party, I didn't want to go. I knew it wasn't really an invitation. It was a summons, another opportunity for her to parade me around as the poor relation. But my husband begged. "It's important to her," he said. "Just show up, smile, and it'll be fine." So I went. I walked into their mansion with my head held high, but my stomach knotted. The air smelled of champagne and expensive perfume. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, laughter echoed off marble walls, and everyone was dressed like they had stepped out of a magazine spread. I had chosen my best outfit, but I still felt out of place like a cheap ornament in a gilded room. Victoria spotted me immediately. Her lips curved into a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Emma," she drawled, sweeping me into a mock embrace. "I'm so glad you could make it. We were just wondering who would pour the wine tonight." Laughter rippled around her friends. My face burned, but I forced a smile. I had learned long ago that giving her my anger was giving her exactly what she wanted. But as I stood there, glass in hand, something inside me whispered, "Not forever." One day she'll choke on her own words. One day she'll see who I really am. That night was supposed to be about her success, her promotion, her shining star moment. But it would become something else entirely, something she could never take back. Because what Victoria and the rest of the Blackwoods didn't know was that the company she was bragging about, the one she had just been promoted in, had recently undergone a massive change, a new acquisition, a new CEO. Me. And fate had chosen that night, that very stage she built to humiliate me, as the place where the truth would finally break free. The night of the party unfolded like a carefully staged play, every chandelier crystal gleaming, every laugh rehearsed. Victoria thrived under the spotlight. She floated through the room in a gown that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, her heels clicking against the marble, as though each step was a reminder of her superiority. Guests clustered around her glasses raised their eyes filled with admiration. And then there was me. I tried to blend into the background, clutching my glass as if it could shield me. But blending in was impossible when Victoria had other plans. She made sure of it. "Emma," she called out loudly, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Would you be a dear and top off Mr. Harrington's glass? He seems to be running low." My cheeks flamed as laughter rippled around the circle. For a moment, I froze. I wasn't staff, I wasn't supposed to serve, but everyone was looking now, waiting. Victoria tilted her head, her smile sharp, daring me to refuse. So I moved. I took the bottle, my hands trembling slightly, and poured. Mr. Harrington, an older man with kind eyes, shifted uncomfortably, muttering thanks, as if he too felt the cruelty of the moment. But Victoria clapped her hands together with mock delight. "Perfect. I always said you had a knack for service." The humiliation lodged itself in my throat like a stone. I wanted to scream, to throw the glass across the floor, to tell her exactly who I was and what power I held. But I swallowed the rage and smiled faintly instead, because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. The night dragged on. Each time I tried to fade into the crowd, Victoria pulled me back into her game. She asked me to fetch napkins, to carry plates, to refill drinks. Her friends laughed behind their manicured hands, whispering, as if I couldn't hear. My husband watched from across the room, his face tense, but he said nothing. That silence hurt worse than Victoria's barbs. I thought back to the girl I used to be, the one who believed love would be enough to shield me. But in that moment, with the weight of the tray in my hand and laughter prickling at my back, I realized I was alone. The room smelled of caviar and roses. Music floated from the grand piano in the corner. Everywhere I looked, there was wealth, extravagance, and the hollow pride that came with it. And I, Emma, the poor waitress, was their evening's entertainment. But inside, my thoughts twisted differently. I watched them smile, watched Victoria's smugness sharpen with every humiliation she delivered, and I thought if only they knew. Because what none of them realized was that the very company Victoria bragged about, the promotion she wore like a crown, was already mine. I had signed the papers weeks before. I had walked through boardrooms, shaken hands with shareholders, stared down walls of men who underestimated me and won. And tonight, I was standing here in the shadows, letting her dig her own grave. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about timing. Victoria made a grand speech halfway through the night, clinking her glass for attention. "I just want to thank everyone for being here," she announced, her voice carrying easily over the crowd. "This promotion means so much to me. It's proof that hard work and dedication pay off." She cast a glance at me, her lips curling. Of course, not everyone understands what real ambition looks like. But that's all right. Some people are just meant to serve. Laughter erupted. My vision blurred. For a second, I thought I might faint from the heat of humiliation pressing against me. But then just as quickly the haze cleared. And what replaced it was not weakness, it was clarity. Because I knew what was coming next. I caught sight of him across the room, Mr. Caldwell, the CEO. Victoria always idolized the man she had framed her entire career around. He was talking to a cluster of executives, his presence commanding without effort. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that this was the moment. When he finally noticed me, his eyes widened. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He excused himself and walked toward me, his stride purposeful. The room didn't notice at first, too wrapped up in Victoria's endless bragging, but when he reached me, everything shifted. "Emma," he said warmly, his voice carrying in the hush that followed. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you'd be preparing for Monday's board meeting." The air in the room stilled, Heads turned, conversations cut off mid-sentence. I felt every pair of eyes on me, heavy, searching, confused. Victoria laughed nervously. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell, you must be mistaken. This is my sister-in-law. She's not—" But he cut her off. "No mistake. Emma is the new CEO. My boss." The silence that followed was deafening. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Someone dropped a fork, the clang echoing like a gunshot. My husband's eyes widened, his face pale. And Victoria, her expression crumbled, her smile collapsing into shock, her hands trembling around her champagne glass. The humiliation that had burned in me all night flickered out like a dying flame. In its place rose something new: vindication. The tables had turned, and for the first time in years I felt seen. The silence in that glittering room stretched so long I could almost hear my own heartbeat. For years I had been forced to listen while Victoria and her parents reminded me of my place. Tonight, for the first time, they were the ones stunned into silence. Mr. Caldwell's voice carried again, steady and sure. "Yes, Emma is the new CEO. She finalized the acquisition last month. I'm proud to work under her leadership." He looked at me with genuine respect, the kind that could not be faked, the kind Victoria had always craved but never earned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Executives leaned toward one another. Guests craned their necks, and the sparkle of chandeliers seemed to tremble with the shift in the air. The humiliation that had sat heavy in my chest all night dissolved into something hotter, sharper: vindication. Victoria tried to laugh, a high-pitched sound that cracked halfway through. "Surely there must be some mistake. Emma, she's just—" But Caldwell didn't flinch. He smiled warmly at me. "I've already had the pleasure of reviewing Emma's strategies. She's bold, innovative, exactly what we need. I've seen CEOs come and go, but she is one of the sharpest minds I've encountered in years." The words rang like bells in my ears. For so long, I had dreamed of being recognized for what I had built, for the sacrifices no one else had witnessed. And now, in the one place where I had been torn down the most, my truth was unveiled. Victoria's glass slipped from her hand. It shattered on the marble red wine, spreading like a wound across the white floor. Gasps echoed, but she didn't bend to clean it. She just stared at me, her face pale, her lips trembling as if her carefully constructed world had collapsed in an instant. My husband's parents looked from me to her, their expressions frozen masks of disbelief. I could see the calculations running through their minds: years of dismissing me, mocking me, treating me as less, only to find out I had been more than they could ever imagine. And my husband? His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open as though he too was seeing me for the first time. He had always known I worked hard, that I was ambitious, but I don't think even he had grasped the scale of what I had accomplished. For a moment, I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel it, the weight of everything unsaid, the years of cruelty turned back on them. Finally, I spoke. My voice was calm, almost too calm. "I suppose introductions are in order. I am Emma Blackwood, your sister-in-law, your daughter-in-law, and as of last month, the CEO of Victoria's company." The words fell heavy in the air. Gasps, murmurs, and shifting footsteps followed. I looked at Victoria, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her pride crumbling like porcelain. "You treated me like a servant tonight," I continued softly. "But the truth is, I've never belonged to your world. Not because I was beneath it, but because I was beyond it." For once, Victoria had no quick retort. Her lips opened, then closed, her hands trembling at her sides. Her friends stared at her in disbelief, their admiration evaporating into awkward silence. It would have been easy to gloat, to throw her words back at her like knives. But I didn't need to. The truth itself was sharper than anything I could have said. Mr. Caldwell raised his glass toward me, his smile genuine. "To Emma, to new beginnings." A few guests hesitated, then joined in. Glasses lifted, voices murmured in agreement. The tide had turned, and Victoria was left drowning in the current. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I no longer felt the sting of humiliation when eyes turned toward me. This time they weren't laughing, they were watching with curiosity, even respect. People approached cautiously, offering congratulations, trying to attach themselves to my rising star. But I didn't care about them. My eyes stayed on Victoria, on the way she stood in the corner, shoulders rigid, her mask slipping with every passing minute. For the first time, she tasted what it meant to be invisible. Later, as the guests began to leave, she cornered me near the staircase. Her eyes were red, her voice low and trembling. "You made a fool of me." I met her gaze steadily. "No, Victoria, you did that yourself. I just stopped hiding the truth." Her lips quivered as though she wanted to argue, but no words came. For once, she had nothing. When I left that night, the marble floors behind me still glittered with shards of broken glass, and the echoes of whispers still lingered in the air. But I walked out taller than I had ever felt before. The humiliation she had tried to bury me with had turned into the very stage where I reclaimed my power. The morning after the party, the silence in the Blackwood mansion was heavier than any insult Victoria had ever hurled at me. The chandeliers still sparkled, the marble still gleamed, but the air carried the weight of shame. It was the first time in years that the house didn't echo with laughter or smug chatter. My husband barely spoke to me at breakfast. He kept his eyes down, stirring his coffee, like it held answers he couldn't face. His parents sat stiffly, their faces pale, their usual authority replaced by a brittle quiet. Victoria never came downstairs. I imagined her curled in bed, replaying every second of the night, before every laugh that had died in her throat, every shard of glass on the marble floor. And me, I sat at the table with my back straight, sipping tea calmly. For once, I didn't feel like the outsider. I wasn't the invisible shadow in the room. I was the truth they could no longer deny. But victory, I quickly learned, doesn't feel the way you expect. It doesn't burst with fireworks or taste like sweetness. It settles in your chest with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. I had wanted this moment for so long, dreamed of it, in every quiet tear I shed alone. And yet, staring at the family who had belittled me, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. Because revenge does not erase the years of hurt. It simply mirrors it back. Later that day, my husband confronted me. His voice was low, tense. "Why didn't you tell me? Why keep this a secret?" I looked at him, my heart twisting. "Would you have believed me?" He hesitated. That pause was my answer. Our marriage had always carried the weight of his family's judgment. And though he had defended me in private, in public, he had stood silent more often than not. That silence had cut deeper than Victoria's words. And now, faced with my truth, he seemed more shaken by the exposure of his family's cruelty than by the years I had endured it. In the days that followed, whispers spread like wildfire. The Blackwoods could not contain the story. Guests who had seen Victoria's downfall retold it gleefully. Executives whispered about the irony about karma unfolding in real time. The Blackwood's perfect image, carefully polished for decades, cracked. Victoria avoided me entirely. I caught glimpses of her, sometimes her shoulders hunched, her eyes downcast. The woman who once strutted through rooms with heels clicking now shuffled like she had forgotten how to stand tall. Her friends stopped coming around. Even her parents couldn't look at her the same way. She had been their pride, their shining star. Now she was their embarrassment. And yet, in quiet moments, I felt an ache I couldn't shake. I remembered how it felt to be humiliated, to feel everyone's eyes on me with pity or scorn. I remembered the sting of laughter at my expense. And though I told myself she deserved it, I knew part of me understood her pain. Still, I couldn't forget the years she had stolen from me, the years of being treated like less than human, of being mocked for every effort I made. This wasn't just karma, it was balance. My husband's parents tried to smooth things over, tried to pretend nothing had changed, but their politeness toward me now felt forced, laced with guilt. They asked questions about my work, complimented my leadership. But it was too late. Words spoken once cannot be unsaid, and wounds inflicted cannot be erased by shallow apologies. At night, lying in bed beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was what victory looked like. An empty house filled with fractured people, a marriage crumbling under the weight of unspoken truths. One evening, I sat alone in the study, running my fingers along the spine of an old journal. I had filled it in the early days of our marriage, page after page of pain, of betrayal, of silent cries for recognition. At the end of one entry, written after a particularly cruel dinner where Victoria had mocked me in front of her friends, I had scrawled, "One day they will regret this, one day they will see me, will." And now they had. But reading those words, I realized something I hadn't before. All those years I had lived for that moment of reckoning. I had measured my worth against their cruelty, believing that if I could prove them wrong, I would finally feel whole. And yet here I was, whole in their eyes, but fractured inside. Revenge had given me justice, but not peace. As weeks passed, the distance between me and my husband grew. He avoided looking at me, avoided talking about the party, avoided acknowledging the deep rift between us. I realized then that our marriage had never truly been ours. It had always belonged to his family's approval. And with their approval gone, there was little left to hold us together. I began to think about leaving, about stepping away not just from him, but from all of them. Because staying meant living among ghosts, ghosts of laughter, of betrayal of a woman who had been forced to swallow her pride until it burned holes in her soul. And as painful as it was to admit, I deserved more than that. The night I packed a small suitcase, I didn't cry. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom watching him sleep and felt only a quiet sadness. Love had brought me here, but it could not keep me here. I closed the door softly behind me, knowing that the next chapter of my life was waiting. The night I left the Blackwood house for the last time, the air outside felt different, lighter, almost forgiving. My suitcase was small, but the weight on my shoulders lifted with every step I took down the stone path. Behind me stood the mansion where I had been humiliated, belittled, and finally vindicated. But I didn't look back. Some chapters deserved to be closed without a second glance. I moved into a modest apartment downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. No chandeliers, no marble floors, no whispered judgments in the hallways. Just quiet. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling the eyes of a family measuring me against their impossible standards. My days were filled with work, and I poured myself into the role of CEO with a fierce determination. The board respected me, employees looked up to me, and Mr. Caldwell became a steady ally. In the world of business, my voice carried weight, my decisions shaped futures. And yet, in the stillness of the night, when the city lights flickered outside my window, I couldn't help but feel the ache of everything I had lost. I lost a husband I once loved. I lost a family I had tried so hard to belong to. I lost years of my life chasing approval that had never truly been mine to earn. But in that loss, I found myself. I learned that strength isn't always about winning battles in boardrooms or silencing those who mock you. Sometimes strength is walking away from people who refuse to see your worth. Sometimes strength is choosing peace over revenge, even after revenge has been served. One afternoon, months after leaving, I ran into Victoria by chance. She was stepping out of a cafe, her eyes tired, her once perfect posture slightly slouched. She froze when she saw me, as if expecting me to sneer, to twist the knife deeper. But I didn't. I simply nodded politely and kept walking. Because the truth was, I didn't need her humiliation anymore. She was already living with it. And as I walked away, I realized that was the final piece of my freedom. I no longer carried her words, her cruelty, her shadow. I was no longer the poor waitress in her story. I was the author of my own. Sometimes I wonder if the Blackwoods ever sit around their grand dining table and think about me. Do they replay the night their pride shattered? Do they regret the years they wasted belittling me instead of recognizing what I had to offer? Maybe, maybe not. But the difference is, I no longer care. Because I'm not defined by their approval, I never was. I share this story with you not for pity, not for applause, but because I know there are others out there living in someone else's shadow, swallowing pain in silence, waiting for the day they'll be seen. If that's you, hear me. You don't need their recognition to shine. You don't need their love to matter. You are already enough, even if they never say it. Family can betray you, love can fail you, but you, your voice, your strength, your story, those are yours alone, and no one can take them from you unless you let them. I once thought revenge would heal me, that seeing them broken would stitch my wounds closed. But now I understand revenge may give you justice, but healing only comes when you choose yourself. So I chose me. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Never let anyone convince you that your worth is measured by their approval. Never shrink yourself to fit into a place that was never built for you. Walk away if you must, rebuild if you must, but never forget you are not invisible. I refuse to be invisible ever again. If my story touched you, if you've ever carried scars like mine, I ask you to share this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their pain does not define them. Like this video, if it resonated with you, subscribe. If you want to hear more truths like mine, and leave a comment. Tell me your story because your voice matters. Because in the end, the most powerful revenge is not proving them wrong, it's proving yourself right.